July 1911, Northern Ontario. If you stood on the edge of the Porcupine Camp that summer, the first thing that hit you wasn't the gold. It was the smell of cooked pine. For 60 straight days, the sun had been baking the boreal forest down to tinder. The moss underfoot didn't compress. It shattered like glass. The swamp beds were dry like cracked mud. And in the middle of this giant, unexploded powder keg sat 3 boom towns built out of raw green timber, housing thousands of prospectors pulling fortunes out of the mud. Every single man in camp knew the bush was dying for a spark. They saw the thin ribbons of gray smoke drifting up from railway clearings. They felt the ash drifting down into their coffee cups at midday. Nobody stopped digging, because when you're standing on top of a rock vein showing solid seams of yellow gold, a little smoke in the distance doesn't look like a threat. It looks like the price of doing business. Except, this wasn't going to be a standard brush fire. What those men didn't understand, what nobody in 1911 understood, was that they hadn't just built a town in the woods. They had built an industrial funnel. When 3 separate spot fires finally collided 40 miles away, they didn't just burn the trees. They created an atmospheric vacuum, a firestorm moving at 40 miles an hour, generating its own hurricane-force winds, pulling oxygen straight out of human lungs before the flames even touched the ground. Within 4 hours, the railway lines out of town didn't just catch fire. They twisted into steel corkscrews. The relief trains burned on the tracks, which left nearly 3,000 people with only one place left to go, a shallow, muddy stretch of water called Porcupine Lake. Picture the scene on that shoreline at 2:30 in the afternoon. You are standing waist-deep in freezing water, holding a soaked wool horse blanket over your head. The air 3 inches above the surface is hot enough to blister skin. The smoke is so thick that the sun is gone, replaced by a dull, pulsing orange sky. And parked on the wooden siding right behind you, less than 50 feet from where hundreds of families are crammed into the mud, is a row of abandoned freight cars. Inside those cars sits a fresh shipment of commercial mining dynamite, and the wooden boxcars are starting to catch fire. Over the next 24 hours, the people in that lake wouldn't just fight a wildfire. They would endure a localized apocalypse, a compound disaster of fire, drowning, suffocation, and exploding high explosives. This is the story of the Porcupine Gold Rush Fire of 1911, and what happened when thousands of people discovered that the one place they had gone to escape the fire was no longer safe. To understand why 3 entire towns stepped directly into an open furnace that July, you have to understand what the Porcupine Camp actually was. It was an industrial pop-up. In 1909, a prospector named Harry Preston slipped on a smooth mound of quartz in the northern Ontario wilderness. The heel of his boot stripped away a layer of moss, exposing a vein of solid yellow gold so thick it looked like someone had poured molten coins straight into the rock. They called it the Golden Staircase. Within 18 months, over 3,000 men invaded the Porcupine Basin. They cleared the ancient boreal forest with violence, stripping trees for timber and leaving millions of dry, resin-rich pine branches piled 6 feet high directly against the wooden walls of their houses. The streets were made of wooden planks laid over dry peat moss. The cabins were built out of green lumber, tar paper, and pine pitch. The Porcupine wasn't just a settlement. It was a 3-mile-wide fuse connected directly to the forest. By the summer of 1911, that fuse was completely dry. A brutal heat wave locked over eastern Canada. For 8 straight weeks, the temperature topped 90 degrees. The vast, sponge-like carpet of black spruce swamps didn't just dry out. It evaporated. The thick layer of moss beneath the trees turned into a fine, powdery peat dust. Inside the mining camps, nobody stopped working. The stamp mills crushed ore 24 hours a day. The steam locomotives chugged along spur lines, their stacks spitting red-hot embers into the brush. Small spot fires started every afternoon. Farmers lost control of brush heaps. Prospectors left campfires burning. Each time, miners ran out with canvas buckets, threw water on the flames, and walked right back to their claims. Because small fires happened every day without destroying the town, they convinced themselves that fire was an inconvenience, not a threat. They mistook luck for safety. Then came July 11th. By mid-morning, the air was so thick with wood smoke that the sun looked like a dull copper coin. Ash fell like gray snow, turning drinking water bitter and gritty. At 11 o'clock in the morning, miners at the Dome Mine looked southwest. Miles away in the bush, 3 distinct brush fires, ignited by railway sparks and clearing fires, were expanding rapidly. Pushed by a violent cold front sweeping down from James Bay, the 3 fire fronts began moving toward each other. At 12:30, they collided. The massive column of rising heat created a superheated updraft, drawing in surrounding cold air and turning the blaze into a self-sustaining atmospheric engine. It generated gale-force winds that pulled trees out by their roots and hurled white-hot embers 3 miles ahead of the main wall of fire. The miners heard a roar like dozens of steam whistles blowing simultaneously inside a narrow canyon. In the streets of Golden City, horses bit through their wooden hitches and stampeded toward the lake. Then the wind shift hit. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the ambient breeze suddenly reversed. A gust of superheated air swept through South Porcupine. Showers of embers hit the tar paper shacks, flash igniting entire blocks from the top down. The escape routes disappeared one by one. To the north, the wagon road to Cochrane was blocked by an 80-foot wall of fire. To the west, the forest was a solid sheet of flame. To the east, the railway line was engulfed, which left nearly 3,000 men, women, and children standing in a burning wooden grid, looking toward the only direction where the ground wasn't made of dry timber. South, toward the shore of Porcupine Lake, where a single line of wooden railway tracks ran along the mud and where a long row of dark, heavy freight cars sat silently on the siding. When a panic begins, human beings do not run in all directions. They run toward infrastructure. They run toward the things that carried them into the wilderness in the first place. The roads, the mine shafts, the train stations. They run toward the illusion that the technology built to harvest nature can somehow protect them from it. At 1:30 in the afternoon in South Porcupine, that illusion shattered in less than 15 minutes. The first escape route to fail was the underground. When the sky turned black and the air grew hot enough to singe eyebrows, dozens of miners did what seemed logical. They ran toward the deepest mine shafts on the property. They climbed down the wooden ladders into the cool, dark quartz tunnels 300 feet below the surface. They believed the dirt and rock overhead would act as a shield. They didn't understand fluid dynamics. A massive wildfire, moving over the mouth of a vertical mine shaft, acts like a giant carburetor. As the firestorm consumes millions of cubic feet of oxygen on the surface, it creates a massive pressure vacuum. That vacuum doesn't ignore the mine shafts. It violently sucks the air straight out of them. Within minutes, the air inside the deep tunnels was pulled up toward the sky. The cool subterranean dampness was replaced by carbon monoxide drawn down from the surface. Dozens of men who took shelter in the deep drifts of the West Dome mine didn't burn. They simply went to sleep in the dark, suffocating before the surface buildings above them had even collapsed into ash. The second escape route to fail was the rescue train. Standing on the wooden platform at the South Porcupine Station was an engine belonging to the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway, hooked to a string of wooden boxcars and open passenger coaches. The engineer kept the boiler pressure high, blowing the steam whistle continuously, as hundreds of frantic people crammed into the cars. Parents threw children through open wooden windows. Men clung to the iron ladders on the outside of the boxcars. The train was packed so tightly that people couldn't turn their bodies. At 1:45 in the afternoon, the engineer threw the throttle forward. The drive wheels spun on the hot steel rails, gained traction, and the train lurched northward out of town. It ran straight into an ambush. 2 miles north of town, the railway line cut through a deep, narrow trench carved into the forest. The wooden ties supporting the steel rails were made of creosote-soaked pine, a chemical preservative that burns with intense, oily heat. As the train entered the cut, the engineer looked through the cab window and saw that the wooden ties ahead weren't just burning. They had burned away completely. The heavy steel rails were floating unsupported in the air. Under the intense radiant heat of the surrounding forest, those steel rails were expanding, bending, and warping into literal corkscrews. The locomotive hit the warped section at 20 miles an hour. The iron wheels jumped the deformed tracks. The heavy engine slammed into the embankment, plowing deep into the burning muskeg. Behind it, the wooden passenger cars buckled, derailed, and came to a sudden, violent halt in the middle of a burning pine trench. The heat was so severe that the glass windows in the passenger cars didn't crack. They melted into liquid sheets that ran down the wooden frames. The wood of the boxcars, dry from 2 months of heat, ignited instantly. The evacuation train had turned into a stationary furnace. Those who survived the derailment didn't run along the tracks. They scrambled out of the burning wreckage, abandoned their belongings on the ballast, and ran through the brush toward the only open space left on the map: the lake. By 2:15 in the afternoon, the entire population of the Porcupine Camp, nearly 3,000 people, had been squeezed into a geographic pocket less than half a mile wide. They were crowded along the northern shore of Porcupine Lake. The lake was not a vast, deep body of water. It was a shallow, muddy basin, barely 2 miles long and less than 3/4 of a mile wide, surrounded on all sides by dense evergreen forest. And that forest was now burning on 3 sides. People didn't walk into the water, they fell into it. Families waded out until the cold, muddy water reached their chests, their shoulders, their chins. They brought whatever they could carry in those final frantic seconds. Mothers held babies above their heads. Men held suit jackets soaked in lake water over their families' faces. Farmers led horses, cows, and dogs straight into the deep mud, where humans and animals stood shoulder to shoulder in absolute panic. Look at what that shoreline looked like at 2:30 in the afternoon. The sky above the lake was no longer gray or red. It was pitch black, a solid roof of thick, suffocating pine smoke, so dense that the sun was completely erased. The only light came from the shore, where a 2-mile wall of wooden buildings and towering spruce trees was consumed by a blinding orange firestorm. The wind generated by the fire was blowing across the water at 50 miles an hour. It kicked up dark, muddy waves on the shallow lake, driving freezing spray into the faces of the survivors. And here was the immediate, brutal paradox of their survival. If you stood up to breathe, the air 4 inches above the water was 300 degrees, hot enough to sear your trachea and collapse your lungs in a single inhalation. If you ducked down to escape the heat, you submerged your face in dark, freezing water mixed with mud, ash, and floating pine coals. People survived by developing a desperate rhythmic technique, dipping their entire heads under water for 20 seconds, coming up for a fraction of a second to snatch a breath of hot air close to the water's surface, and ducking back under. For 30 minutes, 3,000 people maintained that rhythm in the dark. They believed they had reached the bottom of the disaster. They believed that as long as they could stay in the water, as long as they could keep their blankets wet, they could wait out the firestorm until the timber on the shore burned down to ash. They were wrong. Because while they were ducking under the dark water, the radiant heat from the burning railway station was slowly creeping along the iron siding parallel to the beach. And resting on those tracks, less than 60 feet from where hundreds of families were submerged in the mud, sat the string of wooden freight cars they had passed during their escape. Inside those cars were wooden crates marked with red lettering. It was commercial blasting powder and nitrogelatin dynamite, tons of high explosives brought in to blow open the quartz seams at the mines. The wooden walls of the boxcars were already charring black. The iron door handles were glowing faint red in the dark. Inside the crates, the chemical stability of the dynamite was breaking down under the rising heat. The people in the water looked up from the mud, wiped ash from their eyes, and saw the first wisps of white, chemical smoke rising from the wooden roofs of the train cars. They were neck-deep in water. They could not go back onto the burning land. They could not swim across the lake. And the fuse on the shoreline had just run out. At 2:40 in the afternoon, the wooden boxcars sitting on the South Porcupine siding reached their flash point. The first detonation wasn't a single, clean explosion. It was a chain reaction. Inside the charred boxcars, thousands of pounds of commercial blasting powder cooked off simultaneously. A blinding white flash cut through the pitch-black sky. Then the blast hit. For the people in the water, it wasn't a sound. It was a hammer blow against the chest. Water is virtually incompressible. The hydraulic shock waves slammed into the submerged survivors, knocking grown men off their feet and driving people face down into the mud. A wall of displaced water swept across the shallow lake, tearing children from their parents' arms and throwing horses into a panic. On the northern shore, where the boxcars had rested seconds earlier, nothing remained. The wooden train cars, the steel rails, and the ballast were gone. The explosion cleared the smoke directly over the lake for a single split second, exposing the full scale of the disaster. The entire shoreline was a single, roaring wall of white-hot charcoal, and the survivors realized that the water around them had begun to steam. Look at the micro-level human reality inside that lake during the middle of the afternoon. One prospector stood chest-deep in the water, holding a wet wool coat over his wife and two young children. Every few minutes, he reached down into the mud to pull floating embers off his children's soaked clothing before the fabric could dry and ignite. Beside him, a young miner whose eyes had been temporarily blinded by the smoke clung to the wooden tailboard of a floating wagon, calling out into the dark. A few yards away, a woman held her baby inches above the waterline, using her own body as a shield against the showering sparks. Panic had collapsed into something much quieter: total mechanical survival. No one spoke. The only sounds across the entire expanse of Porcupine Lake were the howling of the wind, the distant thud of powder caches exploding in mine shafts miles away, and the rhythmic, desperate splashing of thousands of people trying to stay wet. Hour after hour, the people in the lake held their position. 3:30, 4:30, 5:30. The human body is not built to endure hours of immersion in freezing lake water while surrounded by radiant heat. Hypothermia set in. People whose skin was seared on their faces were shivering violently from the waist down in the mud. Men lost their footing from exhaustion and quietly slipped beneath the dark water without a sound. At 7 o'clock, 6 hours after the firestorm had swept into the valley, the wind finally began to die down. The superheated atmospheric vacuum began to collapse. The roaring wind faded into a flat, suffocating stillness. The sky above the lake slowly shifted from pitch black to a pale, bruised purple. At 8:30, the first survivors began crawling out of the mud. There were no streets anymore, no houses, no railway. Only ash, twisted iron, and bare rock. Over 70 people were dead, burned in the streets, suffocated in the mine shafts, drowned in the mud, or killed by the blast. Hundreds more were severely burned. Nearly 3,000 were completely homeless, standing in soaked, ash-stained clothing in the middle of a vast, smoking wilderness. As night fell over northern Ontario, the survivors gathered in small, silent clusters along the scorched shoreline. Shivering in the cold night air, staring out over a landscape that no longer had a single landmark left standing. If this were a story about any other place, this is where it would end. A tragedy. A ruined settlement abandoned to the bush, a cautionary tale about human hubris, written in ash and melted iron. But you have to remember where this happened, and you have to remember what was sitting beneath that ash. The morning after the fire, as relief trains crawled slowly north over hastily repaired tracks, bringing blankets, doctors, and bread, the survivors did something that seems almost unbelievable to a modern mind. They didn't pack their bags. They didn't leave for Toronto or Montreal. They picked up shovels. By burning away thousands of acres of dense brush and peat moss, the firestorm had stripped the land bare. For the first time in human history, prospectors could walk across miles of exposed bedrock without cutting down a single tree, and running across that bare rock were dozens of previously hidden quartz veins, rich with gold. The fire that had destroyed their homes had exposed the full extent of the ore body. Within days, men were back out on the burnt ground, restaking claims beside the ruins of their cabins. Within a year, the towns of South Porcupine and Timmins were completely rebuilt. This time out of brick, concrete, and steel. The mines went deeper, the stamp mills grew larger, and the Porcupine District went on to become one of the richest gold-producing regions in North America. Human beings are remarkably good at building fragile worlds, directly over the mouth of danger. We build on fault lines. We build in hurricane paths. We build cities out of green timber, in the middle of dry pine forests. And when those worlds burn down, we don't run away. We sweep away the ash, take a deep breath, and start building again.